This is episode 201 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico podcast. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I am pleased to be joined this week for our interview with Blair Dunn. Blair is an attorney and political activist of stripe here in New Mexico. And welcome to Tipping Point, New Mexico, Blair.
Hey, thanks, Paul. Of a stripe. Yeah, that's exactly a good way to put it.
Well, you've been a libertarian. You've been a Republican. You've not been a Democrat that I know of, but you've definitely been,
I've been
actively involved. Yeah. So we're not going to talk too deeply about politics per se. We're here for your legal expertise and knowledge. But, just share anything you want to share with the listeners and what you've been doing over the last several years. I know you're very big in transparency, so
huge in transparency. I think that's the biggest thing. You can't have a good functioning republic, a good government that works for you unless you know what that government's doing. And so our legislature, in their wisdom, saw that at some point and passed the Inspection of Public Records Act and the Open Meetings Act to make sure that people received the due process and they were able to figure out what their government was doing. So that's a big part of it. And the other part of it is that apparently there's a list circulating, and I'm the attorney that likes to sue the government, and it's well known. And I like to see the government follow the law, and that's kind of what this is. And so if you expect the government to follow the law, you're going to have an intersect of politics and certainly an intersect of the law.
Yep. And you're dressed for Memorial Day, casual, so that's fine. We're recording this on Memorial Day.
This is how I go to court these days. I mean, this isn't like...
There you go.
This is literally how I go to court. So
doing those Zoom meetings with the judges.
If they're going to videotape it, it's absolutely got to be, still got to look like it. Sorry. Turn my...
He's very busy on Memorial Day, even.
If you consider taking orders from my wife, busy. That's what that was.
No problem. Well, Blair, we are going to talk about the legal aspects of the current coronavirus shutdown situation, the governor's powers. Definitely want to talk a little bit more detail about open government and transparency and how it's faring. Let's start off. I kind of sent you an off-the-cuff text or email when the governor's order for face coverings came out, and I take it I'm not the only person that did that.
No.
It was a little surprising just as a general political dynamic that it came out when it did after, kind of a couple months of this crisis. But I was surprised that you said, yeah, this is legit. So why don't we start with the face coverings, and we can kind of talk about the laws and underpinnings of all that's going on right now.
That's great. You said of a stripe, and before we got started, I was talking about a Santa Fe, New Mexican article that's quoting me on the subject and saying, look, if this guy thinks that this is lawful, it probably is, because he really doesn't like the government. He doesn't like government overreach, so absolutely. So face coverings, and it wasn't just you. I mean, it literally, right after her press conference, it was like every 10, 15 minutes, I was getting a call from either a former client or current client or somebody who wanted to be a new client, somebody who was just seen me on Facebook and was like, can she really do this? And what can I do? What can't I do? And so I've put out a few things since then to kind of explain this, but there's a kind of a problem with people who don't, and this, look, I brought a book, and I know this isn't a book club type thing, but part of the problem is that we as a population in this country haven't done a good job of educating the public as to what the law is and what their rights are, right? So you end up in this situation where it feels like this is just really bad, and it is. It's government overreach, and that's really a bad thing. But people don't really understand what their rights are, and they don't really understand the Constitution. They don't really understand the law, so they end up at the mercy of lawyers in the government. And there's not that many of us on the outside that are fighting back against this. And it's a system that's been set up by lawyers, unfortunately, over time, and because we understand how the law works. I mean, there's a reason that the Supreme Court is comprised of lawyers and not just everyday citizens. It's because there's this understanding of how to make the law work. And right now you have all these people that are really upset and don't feel that this is appropriate or right, but it's not really the law's fault. It's the fact that we've allowed people that don't have respect for the rule of law to become elected officials. And that's really what's gone on with with these face coverings and with everything in this coronavirus pandemic.
Well, to be fair to the average person, that is, we're not in a traditional legal situation. You know, there's no going through the committee process in the legislature right now. There's no, this is a good idea, debate it in the op-ed pages of the Journal and whatnot.
Sure.
I mean, a law saying, you know, I remember when France did this, I think it was Muslim related, on face coverings. You know, they had a very significant public debate in their parliament or whatever, the
Sure.
French assembly. You know,
Sure, but
the governor's making decisions here by herself with justification.
But we've had that debate. It's not a new debate. It's just we haven't had it happen recently. So if you look at the law, even pre-Constitution, right? So
Pre-U.S. Constitution.
Pre-U.S.
just to be clear.
Constitution,
Yeah,
yes. Sorry, not the New Mexico Constitution.
Just making sure. Yeah.
No. There's a difference there. There's about, 150-year difference there. So, no. So 1793, we have yellow fever sweeping the country. We don't yet have a constitution because the Constitution wasn't adopted till 1787. But at the time they were going through this exercise of Articles of Confederation and then looking at a constitution, they had this go on. And states, especially port states at that point, were able to enact quarantine that took what appeared to be healthy people not showing signs of yellow fever and quarantine them on a ship for two weeks. Wouldn't let them leave. That's really no different than what we've done thus far. That's pre-Constitution. So as the framers are framing up the Constitution, they're certainly thinking about this power of the government, we'll call it the state, to do this. And they were thinking of it being a state power, not a federal government power, to say, look, we have to protect the health of our citizens, so we're going to give governments this power. As a collective whole, we agree that in these situations we need to have a collective assertion of the individual liberty to be free from somebody else harming you. That's really what this all boils down to. So we did it then. The next big notable use of this police power, which was reserved to the states by the 10th Amendment, it's not one of the enumerated powers of the federal government. They're not allowed to do anything of this nature. But the states are allowed to enact these types of measures. Smallpox, early 1900s. 1905, Massachusetts is where this case comes from. The state of Massachusetts said you can pass laws that say that you're not allowed to, or that vaccines are mandatory, and you're not allowed to opt out of that. You're required to go get a smallpox vaccination, otherwise you face jail time or fines or all of the above, which is exactly what our New Mexico law is modeled after. Supreme Court upheld that, said that's a valid exercise of power. Does it in
U.S. Supreme Court.
U.S. Supreme Court.
Okay.
We didn't have a New Mexico Supreme Court.
Well, I was thinking Massachusetts State Supreme Court, perhaps. But.
1912. We didn't have a constitution until 1912, so we didn't really have a Supreme Court. We had a territorial Supreme Court,
right.
But we didn't have. So Massachusetts upholds this. They say, or U.S. Supreme Court upholds what Massachusetts does. You have to get mandatory vaccinations. They say it's a valid exercise of police powers. They recognize in that decision that it does, in fact, infringe upon individual liberty, right? But there's always been this balancing test in the Constitution. You have to give up some amount of your individual right in order for the collective to be able to function as a government. And our Constitution, I think, does a great job of balancing that. But a lot of people at this day and age don't get that that individual liberty does have its limitations and that there are times that a government can step onto it. For instance, yelling fire in a crowded movie theater. That's you don't have the absolute right to just yell whatever you want, whenever you want. You don't have the absolute right to just run around not wearing a mask in this instance. The government's able to make these measures as long as they're for the public benefit.
So let's talk about New Mexico state law as it pertains here and contrast and compare it a little bit with other states, because I know you're knowledgeable about New Mexico state law as it pertains to crises. There's very broad powers for the governor, both in terms of what she can do, like face coverings, but also the duration of that and how long she can maintain her power. I want to talk to you about that in a second, but two states at least, and maybe more, I know Oregon and Wisconsin both had
right.
judges because they have time clocks in their law saying after a month or some other time period, the governor has to get approval from the legislature or do something else. So talk a little bit about New Mexico's laws, where they come from, and then compare and contrast it in terms of some of these powers.
So there's several statutes at play here, right? So the one that everybody thinks about is the constitutional power of a government of the governor of our state. This is constitutional to quell an insurrection or to stop a riot, right? That type of power is in the the Constitution, it does give time limitations. It requires a special session if she wants to pull that power into play and use it. There's also the Emergency Public Health Act, which gives her another set of powers, a little bit more drastic. But then our legislature, and this statute was first passed, and it's been amended several times, the last time being in 2016, passed the Public Health Act. So 90% of what you see Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham doing falls underneath the PHA, Public Health Act. That's 24-1-3, unfortunately, for everybody that didn't want to know a citation. But
now,
for those that want to look it up, that's where it is.
Okay. The riot one, that's the one, and I looked at it, that was the one that had to do with the Gallup situation.
Exactly.
Now, when the mayor of Gallup came out and said, I want to have the governor involved here, they asked for the governor to shut down the city or do a quarantine or whatever.
Right.
And that was the Riot Act.
Part of that, yes. And then the other part of that was grants, right? So you had what amounted to civil disobedience rising to the level, I don't think it really got to that level, but the governor did, of insurrection, right? So she has the ability to quell an insurrection. That means if everybody's like,
it's a nice word, quell.
F you, we're going to do whatever we want. We're going to throw the governor out. We're just going to stop following the law. That's essentially what the mayor of Grants decided he would tell the town to do. That's a power that she does have. I've never seen it invoked voluntarily. Like I've never had. There's nowhere in history, at least in this state, where we've ever seen that power exercised. The closest was, you might remember, Tierra Maria.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, that's the closest thing to an insurrection, and Governor Bruce King at that point did call out the National Guard.
That was Bruce King.
Yeah.
Wow.
Was it 71 or 73, something like that? Yeah. So that was him. So he calls out the National Guard. They send the National Guard up to Tierra Maria. They quelled the insurrection because all those guys said, we're going to do whatever we want.
Yeah, there was an armed takeover of the courthouse.
Right. So it's Reyes Tijerina led a revolt.
Yeah.
Up there. So it's not totally unheard of, but we've never seen where you have this mayor say, "Look, people just aren't following the government's orders. I want the government to come in and take over my city." That's kind of unheard of. It wasn't what happened in TA.
But it's what happened in Gallup.
It is what happened in Gallup.
Okay.
It's an interesting use of that power, but that's a very limited source of her power, and it does have time limits, right? She's not allowed to go, beyond 48 hours or something like that without getting some sort of guidance from the legislature.
Looking at it from kind of the outsider's perspective. Now, I'm sure people in Gallup had very strong feelings about the situation, but they were dealing with a unique issue there, where they are kind of the metaphorical Walmart for the Navajo Nation.
Right.
They are where people from the reservation go to shop on the weekends and go to socialize and do all those kinds of things. And we know the breakout's been very bad there. And whether it's the right or wrong move, it was narrow, focused, etc.
Right.
Now,
so
go ahead.
Well, so that's that power. There's Emergency Health Act, which I think has a lot of people confused. I get a lot of questions from people saying, well, this says that she's only allowed to do this for this certain amount of time. I forget what it is. And
when is the Emergency Health Act? When is that from? What year?
I haven't really looked at that because she's not really using that much. That's part of the issue, is that everybody looks at it and says, well, this is where she's driving her power for masks and for mass isolations and shutdowns and all these things, and that's not really accurate.
Okay.
She cites to it is where she's using some of that power, but she's not limited. And so you have to read statutes in harmony, right? So if the Emergency Public Health Act says this, but then the legislature turned around and passed the Public Health Act, which gives her all of this power, you can't say that this one short circuits that one. They have to be read in harmony.
Okay.
So even though the Emergency Health Act has these time limits, it can't be read to institute those time limits against this other act. It has to be read that if the legislature had wanted her to have time limits under the Public Health Act, they would have put those into that statute. You can't just mishmash them together like that.
Okay.
It doesn't work. So I haven't really focused a lot on that because that's not most of what she's doing. So
for instance, Public Health Act that she's primarily using, and that's the one that was passed in
73.
73. Okay.
Yeah, my grandfather was actually one of the people that voted for it. I have a set of the session laws from when he was in the legislature, and I go back and pull those out occasionally when these pop up, just to see where he was and see what his thoughts were, because he's not around. So it's always interesting. And I think that law, while it's very, very broad, is ultimately well-intentioned and probably powers we do want to have a governor have. I just don't think we want to have this governor have those powers. For instance, it's A through Z, and Z says do all other things necessary to uphold this act. Legislature should never, ever, 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 I can't say ever enough, pass a catch-all phrase in a statute.
Right. Basically, that's saying,
do
whatever you ever want to do, go for it. Yeah.
Right.
And there's no time limit on this thing.
No, it's just do whatever you think as long as you want. And that is a really, because basically that means until the legislature comes back, she gets to do whatever she wants.
But even, this legislature with being largely on her side across the board.
Weren't going to do it anyways, right?
So a question, I guess, we have a special session, June the 18th. Can the governor continue to maintain her, for lack of a better word, dictatorial powers under that law past the special session? Like theoretically, the legislature could come in and say, we believe what you're doing is crazy and unwarranted. They will not do that. I guarantee,
right.
Ironclad guarantee that this legislature will not do that. Even so, they'd have to overturn a veto, presumably.
Well, they'd have to change. Yeah, they'd have to overturn. But yeah, because she's not going to give up the power, right? I mean, that's she thinks she's, like I said, as well intentioned as she may or may not be. She thinks she's doing what we need her for her to do and telling us how to live our lives. The legislature could theoretically show up and change that law. So there's some built-in uniqueness to our New Mexico Constitution and our laws. So she gets to call the special session. They can call an extraordinary session. That's a whole other thing. You have to have 2/3 of both bodies.
When's the last time that happened?
I don't know that that's ever happened.
Right.
I not in either my lifetime or my grandfather's lifetime has he ever told me. So let's go back to 1969.
New Mexico doesn't have a lot of these kind of earth-shattering crises. We're not a natural disaster state. You don't get the hurricanes, the floods, that kind of stuff.
Right.
This is probably the biggest crisis in real terms for government that we've seen, not just in our lifetimes, but going back decades.
I've thought about it. I can't think of an event in the history since other than wars, which is a whole other ball of wax, right? So if you look at New Mexico history and you subtract out all the wars that the country's been involved in, from 1912 to 2020, there's nothing there. There's nothing like that. So I don't know that it's ever been invoked. Maybe it did because we had some sort of a severe budget crisis and we had a governor that didn't do it, but we've got a history of fairly decent governors for the most part across the spectrum of time. So I don't think that's happened. So it takes 2/3, but she can call a special session, which she's done, and she gets to say what they're supposed to address in the special session. But the uniqueness is they get to really ultimately, as long as they can somehow craft it into it's germane and the Supreme Court doesn't disagree with that, because that's where it would ultimately have to go. They could take this up and say, well, look, we're in this crisis. She's calling a special session to deal with the budget crisis because of this stuff. She's creating a budget crisis through the way she's handling it.
Shutting down the state.
Right. We can actually take over and say that a whole bunch of things that she doesn't want us to address are germane, and we get to set our own rules. That's the beauty of the legislature. So they don't have to necessarily do everything she tells them to do.
Sure, but they won't do that. I mean, this group especially, it's but I think it does give credence to the idea that, well, the governor may not be up for re-election, but if you like the way the governor is handling this and the people who are promoting her power, vote for all the progressive Democrats and the liberals in the legislature. We do have all 112 legislators up this fall, and that could be a referendum on her handling of this crisis. And
when I think it's going to turn out to be. I think when you have gentlemen like John Arthur Smith and women like Mary Kay Papin that are leaders in the Senate that are under fire from her, I think they're going to make it a point to stress some of these economic destructive things that she's done to the state. And they're going to point this out and say, look, we've got to address these other things. We have to put some safeguards up so that if a governor makes a bad decision on how to handle a crisis, we don't end up in this situation again. I don't think, like you said, there's no chance that it's going to go through where her power gets limited. But they're going to make it a political point because even there are Democrats that want to make that political point right now.
So let's talk a little bit about the kind of economic and reopening situation. Of course, I think it was Lee County filed a lawsuit against the governor.
I think.
Or maybe, one of those counties. I don't suspect that they are going to get a lot of traction with that, but I'd leave that for the attorney in the room. And just in general, I mean, it's you don't do everything because you think it's going to.
No, that's right. There's a political thing, right? Yeah. So it's very likely that in the 5th Judicial District where Eddy County is, or the 9th Judicial District where the Republicans just filed a lawsuit, that they're going to get at least a favorable decision from a district court judge. that's where it ends, right? It's a political thing. They know the Court of Appeals with what populate or who populates the Court of Appeals, they're not going to go that way, and the Supreme Court certainly isn't.
Right.
So, it's a balancing act politically, and it's not the way I would do it politically, but certainly there are people that think that it's worthwhile to draw attention to the issue through the court system, and that's really what those two lawsuits come down to, I think.
Okay, so talking about regions of our state, obviously some of them have not been affected like others. Is there anything, do they have any arrows in the quiver aside from their legislative representatives? I mean, that's a thin read, but...
They do, right?
Okay.
So I'm a property takings law nerd. I love that stuff, right? So it's a... We're swinging cameras and microphones. This is really important. He's putting both mics on me now. You really do have, there's no emergency clause in either the Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution, and there's no emergency clause to our New Mexico Constitution takings clause, which says that the government doesn't have to pay for this.
Okay.
Right? So that's the big thing I keep trying to focus people back on, is that we can't stop her from doing this. But the Fifth Amendment to the United States Constitution says that if a government takes your private property for the public's benefit, the government has to pay for it.
Okay.
So if your business was shut down by an order of the governor, it falls underneath the Fifth Amendment. All of that personal property and real property is private property, and it falls underneath that. Your business, what you lost, that's real or private property that you should receive just compensation for. And so the nerds like me have a big discussion going as to whether or not there really is an escape clause that allows the government to take it in the case of a public health emergency like this. The case law of recent from the U.S. Supreme Court, and there was a case involving the Arkansas Game and Fish and the Corps of Engineers, where they were flooding this guy's property to alleviate dam breakage or levee breakage. So they were flooding his property on an infrequent basis, but it was certainly damaging his property. The U.S. Supreme Court has said that even though they did it for an emergency reason, they still got to pay for it. That's exactly where we are today. So that's what people need to be looking at, is if you've had a small business that got shut down, you need to be thinking about talking to somebody like me about going back and getting some reparations for the government taking that, getting your just compensation.
This is the part of our show where the attorney number flashes on the screen.
Well, that's true. Like, I'm not.
Well, how do people contact you if they're a small business person who?
If you can't find me in New Mexico, then there's a whole in a crowd. You can't miss me, and I'm there. But I to the point of lawyers being self-interested, I am also working on a piece of legislation that Senator Pirtle is got in front of drafters right now that goes ahead and does an administrative process to do this. Because look, we're $2 billion in the hole with the loss of oil and gas revenues. How much are we going to be out GRT? Another $1 billion, maybe. And then if you look at, okay, now we've had all these small businesses shut down. The government has to pay for that under the Constitution. I don't know, 2 months worth of shutdown is probably, to the small business community, is probably worth another $1 billion or $2 billion. So we've got instead of a $2 billion shortfall, we are looking at more like a $5 billion shortfall, in my opinion. Okay. So the way that we've come about with addressing that, and this is the legislation I worked on, is that I don't think the government has the money to pay direct payments to people that they basically stole their property for the public benefit at this point. So maybe what we do is we give them tax credits, right? So they don't pay taxes into the future. Transferable tax credits they can sell to somebody else that needs to get rid of some tax liability. That gets some relief. So that's what this bill does, is it says, okay, if you were harmed and you were shut down by the governor's shutdown orders, you're a small business, we're going to go ahead and we're going to give you tax credits in the amount of whatever your loss was. They're good for 20 years. You can sell them to anybody you want to, but basically you're not going to pay taxes.
How about introducing a time limit or legislative approval amendment to these emergency clauses to say that the governor has 30 days, a month, whatever, to be relatively free, and then she needs to come to the legislature and get approval for what she's doing, that kind of thing.
This gets to the point of I don't know what the correct timetable is, right? There's a wisdom to limiting that, but 30 days may not be.
It's better than nothing.
It might be, but it might be still too long to alleviate the damage. It might not be long enough for what we want. The problem is that we've elected a governor who doesn't respect that we're adults and can make our own choices for ourselves.
Right.
There's no faith in the people to exercise that individual liberty in a smart manner. So if you have a nanny state, it doesn't matter what timetable you put on there. It's going to be too long because the governor's going to look at it and say, well, I only got 15 days. I better do everything draconian that I can possibly think of to get this under control, because then they're going to come take my power away. Mm-hmm. But if you have somebody that's virtuous, they're going to look at it and say, I don't care if I have a 30-day limit. I'm going to do what's right for the people. I'm going to sit there and I'm going to say, look, we're not going to shut down private businesses. Like she started out with, right? I mean, you look at it, she said, we're going to close mass gatherings. No problem there. We're going to shut down dine-in and restaurants because people are sitting around without any coverings on for an extended period of time, eating around each other, putting things in their mouth. Those make sense. But face coverings, really, none of the science backs that up. And shutting down private businesses and allowing Walmart to remain open, there's no sense to that. It just doesn't make any sense. So it's more about who you have as a governor. The one thing I will say that we should change in the law is we should limit her ability to do mandatory vaccinations. I think that's going to be the really big fight. You want to talk about a revolt? We're going to have one when she goes out, and she's going to makes it an order that we all have to get a coronavirus vaccination. I, for one, don't want one. I don't think the government should tell me to do that. Mm-hmm. My mother's probably going to have to move to South Dakota to get out of this. But that's really where this is going. So we need the legislature to step in and say, no, that's beyond what we want you to have as far as power. You should not be able to tell people they have to have a vaccine.
Yeah, she's definitely alluded to that, although it's not been, theoretically. Well, I guess if it's done during the crisis, she could do it without
she could
coming to the legislature.
Here's the problem with the Public Health Act. That's the other thing, is maybe we need a clause in there that says it has to be a real pandemic, a real crisis. Because the Public Health Act, she could come in and just say, look, this is a public health concern. It doesn't require a crisis. She could just come in and say, look, I think everybody should have this vaccine or that vaccine. Mm-hmm. And the legislature has given her that authority. So limiting it to some sort of a real crisis, I think, is what we got to talk about.
Okay, well, there's still so much to talk about here. There's been businesses that have, quote unquote, stepped out of line. A restaurant in Ruidoso. There's another restaurant they opened before they were given the go-ahead. Gun stores, pawn shops. Yeah. What are we looking at in terms of those kinds of businesses? And, to the extent that you want to talk about it, we've got an attorney general who theoretically is supposed to be defending the, law and people of New Mexico. But of course we know politically he's in lockstep with the governor, at least I assume, but you can.
I don't have any disagreement there. No.
So talk about those businesses, though.
So there's a statute. There's another statute in the Public Health Act that says that this is 24-1-21. Sorry, if anybody wants to look it up, it says that the governor. So, for instance, face masks. The governor can fine you up to $100 or up to 6 months in jail for disobeying one of these public health orders, like this one falls under. The business thing, a lot of people have said, well, she can't do $5,000 a day fine. That's what's in the Emergency Public Health Act. It's not in the Public Health Act. Problem is that we put another catch-all in that statute. It says that they can enforce.
Who is this we you're talking about?
We, the people in our legislature, right? I mean,
I'm libertarian enough to ask that question, Blair.
Who we elect matters, right? So
I hear you.
We through our legislature passed a law that said that the health department can do all things necessary with the aid of the attorney general to enforce these orders. That means setting it as a fine, saying, we're going to send you, this is the pawn shop in Grande is the first example. We're going to send you a cease and desist letter. If you continue beyond this, you're on notice. We're going to fine you $5,000 a day. They did. They did it for another 12 days after that. That's how you end up with a $60,000 fine. That's enforced by the attorney general. He's 100% in lockstep with her. He's not going to deviate from that because he doesn't really have the option to. As much as he could, he doesn't. Even really
if Blair Dunn was attorney general, we'd probably
be having a fight, and there'd probably be Democrats that want to impeach me for not following the order because I think it's wrong. Right? There's things that you do as an elected official, and this is where your virtue matters. If I'd been attorney general, I'd have said no. I said I'm not doing that. That's not right. You're abusing your power. And I'd have probably figured out some way to tie her into the Governmental Conduct Act and say that she's abusing her power because she took donations from, what was it, Costco or Sam's Club? We'd go back and say, hey, look, you're abusing your power for your public benefit. So this may sound a little bit like accusing Trump of colluding with the Ukraine over Biden, but essentially that's what it looks to me kind of like what she's done is she's helping out her big box buddies who gave her donations, and she's trampling the rights of little people. So as Attorney General, I'd say no. There's no science to back this up. This is an arbitrary and capricious order. I'm not going to enforce it.
How about
and she'd have to sue me.
You know, that's Second Amendment, special protections in the U.S. Constitution. Theoretically, sure. She's got more limits there. They're back open-ish, but...
Well, but... So I'm involved. I was local counsel for the Amicus, the Beckett Fund for Religious Freedom in the Legacy Church case.
Okay.
The problem what we have is that the way that
Legacy Church was trying to stay open. They had a film crew that required more than the maximum amount of people. The judge Browning, actually, right. A federal judge, so he ruled against Legacy Church. That's
for the most part, right? So there were certain limitations to what that allowed them to reopen with their staff, right? So and most of this came about from compromise from the governor's office or waving their white flag, whichever you want. I prefer to use the term that they were waving their white flag. That's how we went from that one order that had 10% up to 25% like everybody else for capacity. Mm-hmm. Is that the governor's office took a very harsh view, I think, in trampling in on things that really should have been protected. Second Amendment, First Amendment, allowing freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, and your right to defend yourself. I don't think those are ones that should have been subject to the same limitations as everybody else, right? If something's going to get a special dispensation of favoritism, those are the two types of things that should. Anything involving the First or Second Amendment. Whether or not you get to go buy the T-shirt from the store you want, I'm not sure that that's really covered in that situation. I think that it's okay to limit those types of things, but she should have stayed away from those two things. But Browning pointed out that this was a law of general applicability and it was applied generally. So under the Constitution, it wasn't discrimination against religion. So therefore she was allowed to do it. Again, just because she's allowed to do it doesn't mean she should, but that's what it came down to.
All right. So, well, now we're going to shift more significantly open government. And you represented the Rio Grande Foundation in a few cases on this kind of issue. So just full clarification there. One of those lawsuits, unfortunately, was denied, thrown out, whatever, against the city of Albuquerque, which was in the very early days. But talk about that case and then more broadly, open government in the coronavirus world.
Well, and to begin with, I know this is going to sound typical for the lawyer in the situation, but Judge Franchini was just wrong in our lawsuit. So we sued the city of Albuquerque saying that they passed these emergency measures that didn't allow for any due process from the public, that didn't follow the Open Meetings Act. And she just didn't want to hear it. We pointed out that the ordinance, which they were essentially re-adopting, also had infringements and allowed the mayor the authority to ban gun sales and that kind of stuff, all of which are unconstitutional, no doubt about it. She just didn't want to hear it. And this is the problem with, judges, is especially the way we do it with politics here in the state, is you end up with political ideology driving what a judge's decision is rather than a faithful reading of the law. So what we ended up with was her saying, it's okay.
And this isn't just Blair Dunn, libertarian, free market conservative. This is Pete Dinelli, who is Democrat, pretty progressive guy, I would say. ACLU at least said that they thought there were serious issues here. So it wasn't just kind of the radical right, if you will.
No, and we look at it. A lot of what I would call liberal or left-leaning lawyers are very, very emphatic in their belief in supporting civil rights. In fact, the big civil rights attorneys, more often people think of liberals, liberal attorneys as being those. So it's not necessarily that. So I really do think that what we have are a problem with a belief that the government can fix this and that we need to give them the power to do this. It gets back to that age-old thing. So transparency in government is absolutely the same thing. If you don't know, like the city of Albuquerque citizens didn't know that what they were doing was violating the law, which is a good thing that came out of our lawsuit, is we got some press out of it, right? If they don't know what the government's doing, then they would just assume that what the government is doing is correct. So, transparency of the Open Meetings Act and allowing people to have input into their government is essential to satisfying the requirements for due process. And that's what we went after.
The way I look at it, being a non-attorney, is, the John Roberts Obamacare ruling. He clearly massaged the opinion to get a loophole in there for the approval of a program that was done in a small d democratic process, through Congress, et cetera. And he just didn't want to be the guy to oppose them. Now, Franchini, in this crisis situation, giving a broad berth to the politicians, when in reality, us limited government folk would say, whatever the party, a crisis is the time when you need these protections more than anything else. And, one last thing, I mean, it's kind of an extreme example, but, the Japanese internment, the Supreme Court of the United States said, A-OK, great job, guys. That's an extreme form of quarantine, if you will.
Right. So do you want to keep going on a little bit of more transparency? The other ones?
Yeah. Let's talk about the other stuff too.
So the others are, of course, Inspection of Public Records Act stuff, and that's going after just the fact that if the government's putting things into writing and they're creating a public record, you should be entitled to get into that and to look at what that is. There's a legal aspect to this that we haven't talked about that I think is worth mentioning. I sent a letter last week or the week before to the New Mexico Supreme Court. Like I said, I brought a book. I'm just going to go
by Neil Gorsuch.
By Justice Gorsuch. This came out last fall. It's a republic if you can keep it. And everybody will appreciate this. It's not written for lawyers, right? This is written for your average citizen, right? So one of the big problems we have, and this is part of it, and I think that the reason our democracy doesn't function as well as it should, is that we don't have a true separation of powers anymore. I don't think anybody has any real faith that if the governor is out of line and she's acting unconstitutionally, let's say that she's wrong, not just wrong, but she's acting unlawfully, she's not following the Public Health Act. Yeah, you might get a decision out of Curry County that's in your favor, but we all know when it gets to the Supreme Court, it's just it's a dead letter. It's a done deal. They're going to side with the governor and side with more power.
Because the Supreme Court is 4-1 Democrat.
Well, 5-0 big government. Right? Okay. I'm sorry, Judy is not proven that
Judy Nakamura.
Judy Nakamura, Justice Nakamura,
Republican justice on the court,
quote unquote Republican, yes. She has not shown that she is. There's another issue I've been involved with. We won't go into that one. But most recently, as part of this COVID stuff, the court came out and issued an order suspending evictions. Now, I'm not saying it's a bad policy, but the province of a court is never supposed to be legislating policy. The province of a court is to decide the laws as the legislature makes them, not to make laws. And so you have this court that doesn't, well, it's a good idea, so let's just do it. Mm-hmm. We have some authority over the way the courts operate, so we're just going to use our authority to make rules, and we're just going to go ahead and pass this through. And so now you have a 5-person, not really elected, but sort of elected officials making law for the rest of the state, and they're suspending people's rights. So we now have what is probably one of the most unique cases that has never been in front of the U.S. Supreme Court or never been totally decided on these grounds in front of the U.S. Supreme Court of judicial takings. We talked about that earlier.
So this is the rent waiver.
Outright just like we're just not going to enforce the law here. You can do whatever you want. You have to pay rent. They can't evict you. You can destroy the property. They can't evict you. There's no way to toss them out, really.
And this is currently in effect in the state of New Mexico.
Went into effect about the same time the governor's orders to shut down businesses went into effect. So the court issued these orders staying evictions. That's a big deal. I mean, you have a court deciding and legislating. So I think that's something else from a legal aspect that we're going to have to deal with. I sent a letter. I have a couple clients. I think there's a few of us, quote unquote, conservative lawyers that are going to look at taking a case directly to the U.S. Supreme Court to have them look at that. But this has shown that if you don't have the right people in office that are willing to be transparent, that are willing to allow for due process and respect that we're all adults and not steal your property without real good reason to, that you end up in the situation we have.
All right, let's circle back to the transparency thing because we talked about Open Meetings Act, but IPRA and public records. Now, you've won an award, been honored by the Foundation for Open Government. They're kind of the organization known for being a watchdog around IPRA laws. And
sure.
IPRA is the statute that gives you the ability to request specific information from governments
sure.
around New Mexico. Now, logistically, I think we can all understand that maybe this is a challenge in a epidemic situation, but kind of talk about your views on IPRA. and how it's being obeyed or disobeyed and whether it's legit or not during this whole situation.
Okay, so IPRA is Inspection of Public Records Act, 14-2-1, so on and so forth. Says that in most instances, with a very limited set of exceptions, the government is supposed to provide you access or copies, if they're available, of public records. This has been a majority of my practice, probably since I really started practicing. My first trial was actually a IPRA trial. Governments in this state are notorious for not following it. City of Albuquerque is not just the only one. Certainly, we have Bernalillo County. That's not the only one. They don't want to, and we have cases now. One of them being the City of Albuquerque case that the Rio Grande Foundation is chasing down. That does not, where the government is now, after they delayed for a period of time and didn't meet their obligations to timely provide the records to the Rio Grande Foundation. Now they're saying, oh, well, sorry, we have a pandemic and that's creating these extra work issues, so we're just not going to do our jobs like we're supposed to. Again, that's not one of the excuses the legislature gave them that they could have, is that, oh, well, we've got a public health crisis, so we're not going to provide our records. But, again, if you don't have the right people in office, for instance, Mayor Keller has not made this a priority, people are not going to provide the records. They're going to play games, and then that deprives the citizens of the information they need to make good decisions about what their government is up to participate in meetings, to engage in due process, and they end up on the short end of the stick, and they don't know what their government is up to. So, City of Albuquerque that request was made back in December for a certain amount of records dealing with certain individuals communicating about some of the stuff that the school bond issue that the mayor had advertised that people needed to vote for and misused funds, essentially. There's all these internal communications, and they're talking with people both internal in the government and outside the government about how to get this passed. And your average citizen that may or may not be in favor of it doesn't know what's going into that decision. And so instead of providing those within the 15 days provided in statute, they just delay. And now we get to coronavirus. And what we've seen is that government officials, by and large, just don't care about the timelines anymore. So it really is just an issue of they're just using this as a convenient excuse. There's no reason why they can't, even from their computers at home, let's say they're working remotely, that they can't get in as an IT person and pull those records out and put them out. If it's something that's truly in hard copy, great, but there's nothing like that anymore. Everything is on electronic. So this idea that you can't access records because you can't get into the physical location and view the physical records, just not believable anymore.
All right, well, we are approaching the end of our show here. Blair, any last comments or words of wisdom before we end the week's podcast?
So my plea, and this is truly my plea to everybody in New Mexico, even across the country, is that part of the reason we're in this mess is that we have not taken the time to understand the civics and to understand how our government works, and to make sure that our kids and our grandkids understand that. If you're unhappy with the way things are working, you have to do two things. One, you have to become educated and make sure those around you are educated. And then two, you have to go vote. But not just vote for somebody because they're the same color, political color as you, or they're the same gender or anything else. It really has to be, you look at that person and you see that they have virtue, because when you elect somebody like Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham, who I don't think has exercised virtue in this situation, you end up with her taking your rights away because she thinks that's what's best for you. Find somebody that believes that you're an adult. Vote for that person and understand what your rights are.
All righty. Well, thank you, Blair, and thank you for listening to this week's edition of Tipping Point, New Mexico. Appreciate your tuning in, and we'll see you next week.